Hi, this is Jennifer Charlton, host of Success Happens. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. And I wanted to start by introducing myself as a communication strategist and a consultant. I host a radio show, have for 6 years, but I'm also a daughter of a Swedish immigrant and an all-American guy. And I'm a former Miss Maryland with the Miss America program and someone who loves our country. I got my patriotism from my grandmother and my grandfather. They flew the American flag high. He saluted when he took it down, and he valued the American dream, having grown up poor in Southwest Washington, D.C. He knew what was possible, and he treasured it every day. My grandfather, Millard T. Charlton, must be horrified from heaven, looking down upon what we are witnessing and living through. Like many of you, I was distraught over blatant and flagrant corruption right before our very eyes. As someone who often calls for restoration of integrity in humanity, including government, I was appalled. Since then, it has been like drinking out of a fire hose to absorb the vast amount of alternative media information that is directly contrary to the lies perpetuated by the deep state and our mainstream media. I say they won't be mainstream media for long. So many of us are fighting to tell the truth, sometimes at a great cost. Our very own Governor Hogan just slammed Republicans on CNN with Jake Tapper, and he calls himself one of us. That couldn't be farther from the truth. Our shutdowns, lockdowns, and destruction of industries, businesses, and families has been devastating, all based on bad information and false narratives to drive what? A corrupt election. In Maryland, they reprinted ballots in the spring of 2020. Why would they do that? I wonder. Perhaps they knew what was ahead. A corrupt election to, at any cost, overthrow a presidency and thereby overthrow you and me, we the people. So today we're going to talk about integrity in the election process. And I thought, what better person to have join me than Delegate Dan Cox from the great state of Maryland, who is also a constitutional lawyer and somebody who's been fighting the fight for us on issues around reopening our state and fighting for our constitutional rights through this horrible past year and almost a half. So welcome, Delegate Dan Cox, and the opportunity to speak to we the people.
Well, thank you, Jennifer, and to your audience. I echo your words, just valuing and respecting your heritage and the heritage of freedom in our country. And I'll tell you, both of my grandfathers served in World War II, post-World War II era. One of them a fighter pilot, the other one served in the Berlin airlift as a United States Air Force officer. And then my wife's side of the family, Vietnam veteran was her father, served excellently on his tour with a Big Red One, and came back to the obvious disgust of the people, which was so sad. But more than that, his father served in the Battle of Anzio and received a Purple Heart. So we have a long military heritage of freedom, and that's why, as you know, Jennifer, that's why I felt compelled to, one of the reasons to run for office, and to make sure that the heritage of freedom we have doesn't drop and fall to the ground. And that was why it was an honor to serve with President Trump's volunteer lawyer team in Philadelphia to try to prevent this theft of the election. And our biggest regret as team members is that we weren't able to stop it. It was a scheme of international proportions.
Did you have any idea, Dan, at that time that it was a scheme of international proportion? Did you really know what you were getting yourself into at the point at which they asked you to participate?
Not entirely. There were some concerns. For instance, when we arrived in Philadelphia, some of the other individuals on the other side that were showing up were also clearly from out of state and well connected to groups that seemed to have some interesting connections, such as the Blue Crest voting machine seemed to be obviously something that was brand new and being used and did not have significant American ties. It seemed obviously that there's issues and questions regarding the extent of this, and that's beyond a lot of my purview. But what we witnessed and what we saw was a cover-up of the lawyers not being provided access. I mean, even I believe Rudy Giuliani and his team, when they finally came to Philadelphia, it was a shock to us to see the power of the local officials blocking them from observing the election day process and the counting process in the days thereafter. And the only thing that can be surmised with that is that there are powers far beyond what we understood that were working this election in a coordinated fashion, because we saw that in all of the swing states.
When you reflect back on what happened, do you think that they had been planning this for a while? In other words, this was not happenstance. This was well thought through, as you said, orchestrated and planned. Is that accurate?
That is accurate. There's no way that you could have had these amazingly expensive, massive voting machines, brand new and set up to bring in all of these COVID mail-in ballots and have a rate of error that is not disclosable, allowing all of these mail-in ballots to be pushed through the system without any real verifications of residency, of affidavit verifications, and of secrecy envelope verifications. All of these things are incredible processes that were set up well in advance. And we saw it happening right before our eyes. It was so well oiled, Jennifer, when a member of the president's cabinet's top lawyer was standing with me as a volunteer as well. When we were together there working the main West Philadelphia County review, which had a significant impact on the state of Pennsylvania, because if we could protect the vote and make sure that the vote was a legal vote in that county, we could win Pennsylvania. That was the same with most of the Beltway counties around the city of Philadelphia. And as we know, Philadelphia has a long history of voter intimidation and fraud. So we were there, and this was ground zero, and what we saw there was clearly a well-oiled machine, complete with union representatives wearing masks, working in the polls as badged, authorized access employees and or volunteers in the system, all the way through to the stacks and stacks of these so-called mail-in ballots that came in after President Trump won that night. We watched him win 1 million votes. We knew we won Pennsylvania. And then these stacks of what appeared to us by the naked eye to be very clearly computer-type printout ballots. The ovals were perfect on thousands. I'm talking stacks and stacks of thousands of ballots that were perfectly printed ovals. We alleged that was taking place and needed to be checked because it just didn't in any way seem to match the way that the normal ballots would come in, where you have a ballot where you have somebody sending a mail in and they handwrite the oval in. Well, how come that didn't appear to be the case with so many thousands of envelopes?
So for clarity, then what you're saying is that the ballots had the circles so perfectly, beautifully crafted by a print machine, it was not hand filled in like a mail-in ballot would have to be.
Exactly, and I have a background in education. Before I became a lawyer and before I became a politician, I worked 10 years in the education field, and one of my jobs as an administrator of a school was to administer the standardized testings of high schoolers, including the PSAT test, and many people have heard about the SAT and the PSAT, and I was involved in those, and those have little oval fill-ins. And these are kids taking tests that are, going on to apply to Harvard and University of Maryland and you name it. These are smart kids. And even so, carefully filling in ovals, you still have an occasional bump where you can see it is, in fact, a human hand that was filling that oval in. Well, that's not the case of what we witnessed in Pennsylvania. Vast numbers of those were perfectly filled out and printed, much like almost, in fact, I turned to my friend from the Trump cabinet, the cabinet attorney who was there, and I looked at him and I said, does that look familiar to you? Look at all those thousands of as they're scanning, you can see every ballot, and every single one was almost identical, always a Biden vote, and very few down ballot votes, which makes it questionable.
So they couldn't take time about the down ballot. They just had to get the Biden thing
Sure.
done.
So I said, does that look familiar to you? Because it does to me. And he said, yeah, it looks like a computer printout. And I said, yeah, it looks to me like those sample SAT questions they send college kids, right? The sample testing forms that you fill out. I mean, where they print those out, or other kinds of oval type print-offs. It was just unreal. But that was just one aspect. The other aspect, obviously, Jennifer, and we can go into this as you want to ask the questions, but the other aspect that we witnessed has great impact, I think, right here in Maryland, and that was the integrity of those machines.
All right, so let's talk about Maryland, because that's our state, and in this Defend Our Vote, one of the things that we're doing is looking at each of the states, and we're charged with helping our fellow citizens here in Maryland to defend our vote. And we'll be asking everybody who's listening here, if you live in Maryland and you want to help us, we're going to give you information how to reach out to us, okay? So just stay tuned for that. But Dan, you mentioned something about Frederick County, which you're a District 4 delegate in the state of Maryland, and that's part of your district. The other part is in Carroll County. You mentioned some data to me that I found interesting. Talk about the data for Frederick County, because we've always thought of Frederick County as very pristine in our approach to the election process. But the numbers don't bear that out. Could you share with everyone what you learned?
Well, sure. And I think what we learned in Pennsylvania and in Philadelphia was that we have to begin a verification and audit process in order to protect the election, both the 2020 election as well as our future elections, or else we've lost the country. And we all know this. So what we did was when I came back from Philadelphia, the first thing I did was I pulled some of the reports and looked carefully at them. And sure enough, to my surprise, a great surprise, if you look at the voting in Frederick, we've historically been a very conservative red county. Recently, there have been trends with great numbers of registrations to attempt to trend that blue. Democrats, we know, have been targeting the county for that. Very interestingly, at the same time, there's a moratorium on building in the county. So how people are moving in without new housing being built that wasn't already in the pipeline is questionable, although there was some housing significantly in the pipeline. So that is one answer potentially. But what we noticed and what I looked at were the numbers of registrations far outpaced the history of Maryland and of Frederick County. For instance, we had, under President Trump's presidency, we had 23,000 new registrations in Frederick County. And yet, literally, I think the average building of houses was somewhere below 1,000 a year. So we might have had 4,000 houses built, and probably less than that because of the general state of things and how long housing takes to build during a moratorium in Frederick County. So if you think about that, 23,000 new people moving in allegedly to Frederick. And interestingly, what I looked and discovered was that although Hillary had lost to President Trump by 3,000 votes, and that President Trump had gained approximately 9,000 new votes because of the red wave that came out for him in Frederick County, somehow Basement Biden came up with 21,000 new votes above Hillary's numbers. Now, how that was possible is a real question. And I think when you look at those numbers and you start realizing 23,000 new votes, 21,000 for Biden, and then you look at the question of demographics and where are these people moving from and are they true residences, we realized quickly, and I put forth a PIA on this, not to question the local elected Board of Elections, but the fact that these numbers were alarming and not explainable under normal statistical analysis lended an important review. And to date, we've been stymied from having a full, complete access to those records, and we're still pursuing them. But
when did you submit the PIA?
that was submitted, attempted to be submitted in December, and then was finally, I believe, our Central Committee followed up with a letter to the local board on January 4th.
So one thing I want to mention to everybody listening, that we're going to, by the end of this 1 hour, we're going to give you some tools. Mm-hmm. One of those tools is pursuing a Public Information Act, PIA. In our Maryland area, it's called an MPIA, and you have the power to request that. If you have a group or organization that you're working with, that group or organization can make that request. They are compelled to answer. So the fact that they have not responded, what are you doing about that, Dan, to hold them to account, to deliver the information, because we have a right to know the truth?
Well, we're working through the committee, the Republican Central Committee, which I'm a member of currently. They agreed with my vote to have this request for an audit, and we were going to pay for it. Unfortunately, with myself being in session the last 3 months, there hasn't been any action in the Central Committee at this point to move that ball. So we're looking, to moving that forward now that I'm finished. It is a question, though, of just getting access, and the law is clear. They're supposed to have provided the information within 30 days. They have not. We're going to follow up on that and get access to that information. But one of the things that I've noticed in door knocking, just in random samples, and obviously this is not a scientific test at this point, it's just random samples, but in some of the communities that allege a massive number of Democrat registrations changing. But one of the problems that we've noticed is that there are multiple registrations at houses that we may or may not have the same number of residents listed in the property records and in mail records, et cetera. So there are multiple adults at certain Democrat houses. In fact, in certain areas, without getting into too much detail, in certain areas of the county from our sampling, we're showing 4 or more registered Democrats at a particular residence when a home appears to only have 1 or 2 individuals living there. Now, obviously, this is not scientific. We're just starting the process.
I mean, have they registered dead people?
Well, that is a concern across the line, and I'll tell you why that's a concern. And it's just because the nature of things in Maryland and Pennsylvania. When we were there, there's a deadline, for instance, in Pennsylvania to challenge dead voters, and what that means is you have to be able to do incredibly fast research within the 5 days after the election. In order to actually, it's the election's Tuesday. I think you have to have the certification in up there by Friday of your thousands and thousands of dead voters. And yes, dead voters do vote, and that's a problem. The reason why they do is not just for fraud, but because of the mail-in scheme. The mail-in ballots allowed people to vote weeks and even months in advance. And then when people pass away, that vote is not valid. And why is that? Because the Constitution of the United States of America says there is a day for voting. It's called Election Day. You can't start voting months in advance and then have that ballot count. And unfortunately, in Pennsylvania, they did count them for the most part. There were many that the Secretary of State, I'm aware of, tried to eliminate some of them that were challenged. But the Republican Party of Pennsylvania decided against a certification challenge of many of those deadline ballots. Simply, I think, and what I was told is simply because they were overwhelmed with the deadline. And as a member of Trump's team, that was concerning because we wanted to press every single challenge. That was the issue. And unfortunately, we kept getting rebuffed many times. And that's sadly the way it happens across the state.
Rebuffed by whom?
It's a matter of fact that we had to report up. And I was part of the reporting up of concerns with the president's team to individuals like Rudy Giuliani, of individuals from the RNC. And again, lots of great people with the RNC, but a couple people that were in Pennsylvania from the RNC and also potentially with the Pennsylvania State Party that saw things differently, made their arguments as to why the president's team's view was not something they agreed with. One of them being the deadline. I personally demanded that we challenge all the thousands of voters who were dead by the 5 p.m. deadline. We had that list. We were compiling more of them because you have to do cross checks with Social Security, with obituaries, and with other Department of State records. You have to do that very quickly. We had many of those thousands of challenges, just like we had challenges of the provisional ballots and the mail-in ballots. And sadly, on each of those challenges, certain individuals overruled us and waived those objections. And so thousands of ballots were counted that were unlawful. In other words, were not allowed to be counted.
So let's talk. So the message here is know your team. Number one,
absolutely,
know your team and trust them. And if you don't have them on your team. That's a lesson here. Absolutely. And we know that there are rhinos, and unfortunately we live in the great state of Maryland where we have many, and unfortunately they portray themselves to be conservative or on our team, and they really are not. So they undermine the process. So we got to make sure we know. So now I want to get into, before we have to go, I want to get into what actions can we take? What do we need people to do to, one, correct this election? Because I am a firm believer, I've said it from the beginning, we need a do-over. We need a do-over. But if we can't get a do-over, we got to correct this thing, because it's a mess. And if we don't, we lose our country. They're already putting things in place that will substantially undermine our Constitution and our prospects for the future. So how do we correct 2020, Dan? Quickly, kind of bullet, if you would, for us. What are some things that people need to do?
Well, first and foremost, they need to be involved in their local Republican Party central committees. And the reason for that is those central committees, county by county, have tremendous influence in the local elections. And the local elections, as we all know, are the elections that win the elections for the entire state. I mean, that impacts the entire state. And so, for instance, in President Trump's case in Pennsylvania, and we had some great people on the ground and as well as in the county party, but if the people involved had been more able to exercise their powers without the state party officials overriding them or other impacts, it would have been a much better outcome. I think we would have had greater challenges. And that begins with people getting involved in their central committees and in the state party. That's essential. The second part that needs to happen is citizen and voter auditing. I mean, we need to have groups of caring people who volunteer their time to put in, like in Maryland, we have the Public Information Act request. Every state has a form of this Information Act request. They need to put in a letter for that, and they need to review the data. And there are, ways to raise money. I wish the party, in fact, if you're involved in the party, you can try to raise money to do this auditing as well. But here's some of the aspects of auditing that can be done. Access to mail-in envelopes. Why is that important? Because the envelopes are mandated by law to be signed under oath, sometimes twice with an affidavit. If they are not, that ballot is an illegal ballot. The reason why this is important is because you have vote harvesting. We all know that vote harvesters with the Democratic Party went around precinct by precinct, gathering ballots for individuals and even allegedly paying people to produce those ballots and to vote. Now, what happens with vote harvesting is that when you have massive mail-in balloting, you also have a massive mail system that mails those ballots out. And they're sitting out there in people's houses. So these vote harvesters go around door to door from the Democratic Party and do what I believe is illegal and maybe a technical bypass in Maryland law, but it's not appropriate to be in any way influencing people's ballots, such as certainly not paying people to get those ballots turned in and then watching them fill out the ballot and making sure they vote a certain way. This is absolutely not the democratic system. But what happens with that process, when you have the massive mail-in system, there is no check presently on the signatures. The law, and everyone will tell you, oh, there's no voter fraud because we have verifications in many different levels. You have affidavit signed verifications on the envelopes. Then you have cross-checking with the signatures on the voter registration file. Then you have a check on the precinct list of registered voters that are active and still living there. All of these protections exist, they say. The problem with that is they rely entirely on these voter machines to check whether there's even a signature on the ballot. And depending on how you calibrate the machines, which were paid for in many cases by people like Zuckerberg, we had the Blue Crest machine in Philadelphia. We have, I think it's called EMS or E&M machines here. ESNS machines in Maryland. The way those are calibrated matters, because if they are not picking up signatures, then they're allowing ballots through that are not affidavit signed, first of all. Secondly, if they're not cross-checking with the database the actual signature, then anyone can sign. And we found this. I found over 6,000 and made these challenges, 6,000 provisional and absentee mail-in ballots in Pennsylvania that we challenged in just one county that was around Philadelphia, the West Philly area. And in those thousands of challenges, many of these signatures did not match at all. So you would have a scribble on the envelope, obviously from someone who didn't know who they were signing for, but they just scribbled to trick the machine, in my opinion. Then you look at the voter file, and I would...
Did it work? Did it trick the machine?
Yes, because they were not kicked out. They were just they were allowed in. And if it's provisional, this is how our sampling came up with the data, because we were able to see every single provisional ballot because those weren't put through the normal machine process.
For the people watching, what do we do to catch it, or how do we correct it at this point?
Sure. All of those envelopes exist. By law, they're not allowed to be thrown away. To date, to my knowledge, no one has audited those mail-in envelopes. We know for a fact that absent the massive dumps of mail-in ballots, President Trump won 90 million or so votes in this country and is the president of the United States. However, after 10 o'clock, when they shut down polls very oddly throughout the night, all of a sudden these mail-in ballots started being dumped. And those ballots are mandated to have affidavits with their envelopes. And to date, and this is, I think, what they might be doing in Maricopa County, Arizona, but I know to date in Pennsylvania, I issued a demand. I know the Rudy Giuliani team received that demand, and we're submitting that through the state party to review those envelopes. But to date, the court procedures that we were involved in denied our access to that information, just simply did not grant that kind of access. So it needs to be accessed through Public Information Act requests instead of court orders. And that is still out there. It's still able to be done.
For sake of time, because we only have an hour, I want to make sure we move through a couple of things. Can we do a class action lawsuit against Smartmatics or the machine companies? So people are clear. Apparently, Smartmatics and Dominion have subsidiary companies, and that's how they kind of work their way surreptitiously, under the radar with these various companies that are nefarious acts to weight the votes and to do what you said about the, seeing the signatures or the little round holes that we're supposed to fill in. So they've jerry-rigged the system, and it is a coordinated attack, we know that, across the country. Is there not some legal action, you're an attorney, some legal action we can do collectively against that company to get a temporary restraining order?
Well, I'm not going to speak directly to those companies. I don't have enough information about any particular company to speak on that, either in speculation or in a legal sense. So I'm just talking from my experience as a citizen and as a voter and as a representative alternate delegate for the President Trump team and as a member of his volunteer Lawyers for Trump. We saw that there was a need to at least review and check and audit the metadata and the chain of custody data from any machine. And I don't care what machine or company it is, they have a chain of custody data report, and they have metadata reports for the counting process of these mail-in ballots, showing whether or not they're reflecting the actual numbers of the ballots and the votes that were supposedly counted. So we put an electronic hold request under federal law. We issued that. I know that was something that I drafted for the Giuliani team. Those electronic hold requests can be pursued, but that's beyond what it was involved with. But what I think we can do as citizens is issue Public Information Act requests on that same metadata, on that same chain of custody data from all of these machines, and we can have a fundraiser process across the United States for all of these swing states like Pennsylvania, and even states that I believe were like Maryland, that President Trump won on election night handily, overwhelmingly. And yet, all of a sudden, the mail-in ballots come in and allegedly flip the state for Biden. But we don't have any verification of the envelopes, like I mentioned, with the signatures. We don't have any verification of the chain of custody of these ballots and of the metadata, so that we can then verify, okay, the machine says, this county had 100,000 ballots that came in for Biden and 110,000 for Trump, but yet that's what the machine is saying. That's what the metadata, and yet all of a sudden the actual numbers being produced at the end of the day show that somehow when you combine the mail-in voting machines and all the other counting processes, Biden wins by over 100,000 in a county that never should have gone that hard for Biden. That those statistical numbers have to be audited and checked, and they're not being done in a substantive way, to my knowledge, in any of these counties in Maryland. I know Maryland has a audit process, but they do random sampling, and this is a bill that I put in to make it mandatory prior to certifications to do more than random sampling, to do higher percentages of checks on this data. But right now, they certify it without even auditing in Maryland.
Okay. So let me ask you, why do you think they reprinted the ballots in spring of 2020? Remember, they reprinted all those ballots, and the governor came out and said, oops, I don't know what happened, so we have to redo the ballots.
I think something is there. I think someone should investigate and find out why. It's very odd. I also am aware that, and I was informed that there were literally hundreds of thousands of ballots available in addition to the numbers of voters that we had in Maryland. Well, why is it that when we have, 3.5 million or so voters in Maryland, whatever that amount is, we only have 6 million or so people in Maryland. We have a very limited number of voters that are actually lawfully here and registered lawfully in Maryland. And yet we printed, I think, 3 times the number of voter ballots. And those were all held in warehouses. So we had stashes and stashes of ballots that were blank and able to be accessed and used. And there's been no audit on what happened to those numbers. Every single ballot, not only that was voted, should be counted, but every ballot that was printed should be audited as to where it is.
And accounted for.
And accounted for in connection and verified according to the voting lists for every precinct and county. So this is pure madness when it comes to a free and fair election, to say that everything was done by the book. It just wasn't. It's worse than some third world election process.
Well, it was done by a book. It just wasn't a book we want to read.
Right.
I just want to thank you, Dan, because you have been out there fighting the fight to represent businesses and families and employers and employees and all of us who've been deeply impacted by the China virus and the way it was managed and handled here in the state of Maryland and so forth. And you've taken a lot of hits. They've smeared your name. They've tried to character assassinate you. And I want you to know if appreciate you putting on the armor and putting up the fight. Because
thank you.
It's not you who, right? I told Dan before we did this, to everybody who's listening, we need about 3 or 4 more Dan Coxes on our team. And you've been heroic.
That's very great.
You really have been.
Thank you.
And
And I
I'm
know
so grateful for you.
you also and your father's been in the fight. I appreciate all that you've been doing and supportive, and we will carry on. And I absolutely, am honored to do my part in any way I can. This is, I have a stake in this country too. I have a large family. My wife and I have, born and raised in the Maryland history here. We love our state. We love our country, and yet we see it teetering on the balance of totalitarianism, and that's got to end. And the way it ends is we as citizens exercise our rights and our due process. So it's an honor to fight. And they say, when you're getting smeared and taking flack, it must mean, I'm told, that you're over the target, but we'll see.
I think you are right, dead on, honestly. And I've experienced it too. I mean, I've been, attacked, and right now we just have to trust in God, our faith, our team, and know thy team members, know who you're playing with, everybody. It's a big deal. Make sure you got the right people on your team. Thank you so much.
If I could say one more thing too, Jennifer, just on that note that you just said, President Trump and his family deserve, as we know, a huge amount of applause, support, and just absolutely grateful for them in everything they have done. If you had seen, Jennifer, what was going on, and Rudy Giuliani as well, that man is a saint. He is a standard bearer against evil in our land. And if you had seen in Philadelphia some of the things that we saw, and in the ranks of the Republican Party, to see President Trump and his people graciously hold up the flag when others were saying, you know what, let's just call it in. You know what, let's just concede the election to basement Biden. You know what, President Trump, to his credit, said, let's make sure every vote is legal and counted. Let's make sure that the American people are protected. I am so grateful to him for that. No other person that I can think of in the history of my lifetime has been willing to stand up for our laws and our freedom like President Trump. And and President Reagan obviously is up in that category, but I'm just so thrilled with President Trump and his service and leadership. It was an honor to do any little part to help, and all of his team. Jennifer, you would love his team. I mean, these are people that are heroes that have given their all and now are smeared. I know one guy was in tears as a friend of mine. We were just, having a beer together, and he was just sharing that no law firm will touch him now because he served the president. And I said, you know what? That's a badge of honor. Hopefully the American people will see that, and that we'll carry this forward. The end is still to be written.
Well, on that note, I think that we, the people, need to have the backs of the people who were out there on the front line, and you and your attorney buddies and gals out there who have taken the flack. We have to see how we can connect everybody, because it shouldn't be that they have no useful purpose. Maybe they actually you have more purpose now than ever because you were in that position. And so God closes one door and opens another. So hopefully there are opportunities to put these good people to work and in saving our country. So God bless you, Dan. Thank you so much. And thank you for sharing that about President Trump. I also feel that his family really went through so much for us, and we should all be very grateful. All right. God bless you. We'll talk soon. Thank you.